Okay, now I'd like to introduce our next guest speaker, Associate Professor Judith Cashmore from the University of Sydney. Judy's a developmental psychology, and while she works within a law faculty, she was stressed that she's not a lawyer, she's a developmental psychologist, but has had a focus on law and involvement in children's, her research involvement in civil and criminal proceedings where children are involved. She's also done a lot of research about decisions that are made about children's lives. The special focus of this research has been on children's experience and perceptions of processes and the implications for social policy. She has worked as a consultant for various government agencies and been involved in numerous state and federal government committees concerning children and families. Her work has recently focused on the effects of child sexual abuse, and Judy was instrumental last year in holding a similar seminar to this on historical abuse at the time the Royal Commission was just getting started. Currently, Judy is doing a number of research consultancy roles with the Royal Commission. I'm very grateful that Judy agreed to come and speak today, and I'd like you to welcome her to the stage. Thanks, Judy.
Thank you. Thanks, Patrick, and thanks for the welcome and the invitation. And I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present of the land on which we're meeting. Look, what I'm going to talk about today is the general overview. I'm going to bring us back. David is a social scientist, so am I. I imbibe freely in the law school. But I wanted to focus particularly on issues that, as they relate to men, and to provide the evidence base, as we know it at the moment, from a whole range of research, and also make a call for interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approaches to this issue. Because this is not one area that psychology or social work or medicine or criminology or anything like that can deal with alone. We really need a holistic picture to provide the proper approaches to prevention and to follow-up and to treatment and to understanding in particular. So I'm going to be looking at some of the gender differences, and a lot of the research does talk about that, and it's sort of incidental, but on the other hand, it's important to understand what male and female survivors have in common, and also what is different, and particularly for men, and how you would deal with that differently, particularly given the dearth of male-focused services. There's some current papers. One that Rita Shackle and I, and this is work that I've been doing with Rita and also with Patrick Parkinson. Rita and Patrick and I are currently working on a research project for the Royal Commission, looking at the impact of delayed reporting, delayed disclosure and reporting and prosecution, and how it's dealt with within the criminal justice system. A very complex but fascinating project. So what I'd like to do first is, because there's an understanding clearly that there's an association between child sexual abuse and later outcomes. But what we really need to do is understand the sort of question that David was asking. Why is it that some people can come through that process and survive and look asymptomatic, as it's called in the literature, and for others they don't? And that's the sort of understanding we really need to have. And it would be nice if it was a straightforward picture, but it's not. And in teasing out the impact and the effects is not straightforward at all. And I'll go through some of the reasons for that. Just briefly, they relate to estimating the prevalence, the the prevalence for both males and females, and for those who never disclose. And that's the problem in a research and also policy and practice format. And there are also lots of different definitions of child sexual abuse and how that's dealt with in the literature, in research, and different studies and different samples and methodologies. And the other issue that's important is who's giving these accounts, who's telling us about the abuse experience, and who's telling us about the follow-up and the outcomes for these people. So to tease out the effects, the word effect implies causation. And looking at causation is, again, as we tell our research crime methodology students over and over again in their course, it has a few criteria, and if you're going to be looking at research in this area, you need to be attentive to those. The obvious is that abuse occurs before the effect. Now that sounds obvious, but it's also one of the problems in this area because a lot of the things that go along with the abuse are things that can also have adverse outcomes or cause adverse outcomes for children. So we need to know what else is going on for these children and adolescents, and that might also be predisposing them to less than positive outcomes in later life. And the real difficulty here is that one around family environment, because in research terms it can be both a risk factor, a correlate, something that goes along with it, and also an outcome. Because in some families it's actually the disclosure that leads to massive disruption in the rest of the family. And we know in terms of family law processes, it's one of the reasons for separation. I'll come back to the conflation. But the other thing we really need to understand more clearly is what's the link? What's the plausible mechanism that would link child sexual abuse on the one hand and later outcomes, adverse outcomes on the other? So, as I said, estimating the prevalence is not easy. It's not straightforward at all, and if you look at the literature, you'll see the numbers of different estimates that occur. But the biggest problem we have is that unknown dark figure, because there are many people in the community who have never told anyone at all. Some may have told those close to them. Some then may go on to talk more formally in an official capacity, but they tend to be the minority, or there are fewer of those. Now that causes problems if you're wanting to, as a lot of research does, is say, okay, we're going to compare those who've been abused with those who haven't. If you don't know how many in the so-called non-abused group actually have been abused. So it's possible that you're actually underestimating effects in some of this research as well. The other problem, and this is about being an intelligent reader of research, is that you really need to understand who was the subject, who were the participants in this research. Who are we talking, as is common in US studies a while back, college students? They're easy convenience student population to research. And in fact, in psychology departments here, a lot of psychology students are required to be research participants as part of their training. Now, presumably there are specific ethical issues around that when you're asking them about abuse questions. But the problem that comes here is that college students are not representative of the overall population. They tend to be young and more highly functioning. And the problem is that a lot of people who've been abused don't get through into that process. They don't finish their education. They have all those other. So you can have the general population studies, which would be the ideal and the national representative ones, and we've got increasing numbers of those, which is very useful. And then, of course, what has been the case in a lot of this research earlier on was that there are clinical samples. So if you've already selected for people who have self-presenting as having problems, then that also is going to give you a different picture of the outcomes than if you go for a more general, less specialised population. And then we've got a group of studies which are also very useful, which are follow-up studies where there are official reports of abuse. One of the problems, if children are abused very young, they may not remember very much about it at all. What was striking about some of those accounts that we just heard before is that these 5-year-olds were remembering it very clearly. And I'm not saying they don't, I'm just saying that sometimes the criminal justice system and the other systems don't listen very well and are not willing to admit those people to give evidence either. So it's a matter of who is the group that's the part of this research population, and taking that into account in terms of reading and making conclusions. And then there's the next issue. And this is around whether or not it's contemporaneous. Is this someone telling you at the time that it happened? Or is it someone telling you years after the event? And I'm not downplaying the retrospective at all. I'm just simply saying that memory is not a videotape, and it is reconstructed. And the difficulty, of course, for historical child sexual assault matters before a court is the lack of evidence that might be regarded as admissible and likely to convict. So, and as I said before, the other issue is it the same person reporting the abuse as the consequences? Now, of course, that makes a lot of sense, but there also, in statistical terms, we've got something called shared method variance, which means that you tend to inflate the measures than if you had different measures, say official reports. And that's why some of these other studies where they go back and they can go back to records where child protection services have records of abuse, the police may have records of abuse, the agencies involved may have records of abuse, and they can talk to the actual experience as well as putting that together with the reported experience. Let's look at some of the definitions, and they vary a lot. One of the best studies, and our Kiwi friends, they've done much better in longitudinal studies than we have. They started earlier and they've gone longer. And the Christchurch study with David Ferguson as one of the original researchers is a really key study. Now, the way they defined it is whether before the age of 16 anyone had ever attempted to involve them in one or any of 15 different sexual activities when they didn't want this to happen. Now, there's been a whole debate in the literature around some researchers called Rind in the US that even went to the House, to Washington, because of its controversial nature. And that was around some of these suggestions of wanted versus unwanted. A fascinating area of looking at the issue of research to policy and practice. And then you've got 3 categories that these 15 different types of sexual activity in this study were in, and these are commonly the ones that are used: non-contact, contact with any form of physical contact, and then those where there's actual sexual penetration. And interestingly, this is where the law also gets complicated, because before about, and it varies across states, but generally in Australia, before 1980, approximately mid-1980s, rape was defined as penis-vagina. It was not defined as any other form of penetration. So when things are now prosecuted, they have to be prosecuted by what was the offence at the time of the offence. So that becomes complicated, which we're learning in the research. The other is the ACE study, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study in the US, which is an important study. And if you look at this one, it uses slightly different terminology. So the definition of sexual abuse here is, did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you, or have you touch their body in a sexual way, and attempt or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse? So you can see that if you put those two studies together, you're not going to get exactly the same definition. One was under 16, this one doesn't specify that, but it does specify a person being older than 5 years older. And what we're now seeing in the literature and increasingly in the stats is that there is a higher proportion than I think a number of us suspected of children who are sexually abused by their peers, siblings, schoolmates, others in residential care and so on. So this is working through some of the issues about just getting to the point of understanding the research. The Christchurch longitudinal study is, as I said, an important one. And again, it does throw some light on some of the retrospective accounts. So when they asked people at 18 and at 21 whether they'd, by that definition of under 16, etc., they weren't able to ask before they were 18 for ethical reasons, there was some instability in response. That doesn't mean, I'm not saying that means they were lying, it means that at the time the person was talking, maybe they're over it, they don't want to talk about it anymore. So they give one response at 18 and another at 21. But it does complicate things, and what they've done from then on is to combine those two ages. So you can see that you get people who said it happened at both times, some that said it happened at one and not at the other. But the interesting thing that they found is that it wasn't associated with their psychiatric or psychological health at the time of report, which they measured in various ways. But so we can speculate, as they do, about the reasons for that difference. And then we get to a group of more rigorous studies. Well, some of the nationally, I'm not saying more rigorous than the Christchurch and the ACEs. I'm just saying than some of the earlier ones. So we do have a group of studies, and anyone who wants the literature, I'm happy to assist in that process. And at the end of the process, we've now got a group of meta-analyses. And again, we're getting a whole heap of debate about what those meta-analyses actually are showing. And I think the most recent is by Hilberg, where it's a review of the meta-analyses. For those of you who don't know what a meta-analysis is, it's where you look across a group of studies, and some of these have got 20, 30, 7, some of them I think was 50 studies, some of them as small as 7. What they're trying to do is pull out what they call an effect size. So it's not just whether it was statistically significant, but what does that mean? How big is the difference? And there is a rule of thumb that around about 0.3, up to 0.3 is small, around about 0.5 is medium moderate, and about 0.7 and so on is a big effect. So what these studies are now trying to do is pull the results across, and that's very useful. The problem, as Hilberg points out, is that if you've got garbage in terms of what's in your initial studies, you don't make it better by pooling it. I think we learnt that with the financial crisis. So the other thing that we need to look at is something around the mechanisms and what's the impact. And these, I think, would probably be well known to you who are sitting here. It's the worst, perhaps, aspect is that distortion and the abuse of the relationship. Because people who have access to children in this way are usually have that opportunity, and they have the opportunity because of the nature of their relationship. So it's about the sexualisation and the betrayal of their trust. And that often, that sexualised behaviour is unfortunately what's sometimes distorted in court proceedings. I'm not going to go into the stuff around the stress response, but if you look at the medical literature and brain development literature, that is a very useful place to go. The other thing we really need to do is distinguish between disclosure and reporting, because that disclosure for many children and young people, as we're now seeing from the literature, is usually to a friend first. For adolescents, it's usually to a friend. To partner for adults. And for children, sometimes their disclosures are actually accidental. They don't really realise what they've said. But it's a matter of who are they telling? Is it into an official capacity, or is it to that informal capacity, and what do people do with it? And then we have this issue. And the problem is that substantial underreporting. We know there's underreporting because there are lots of people who never do, or they tell you later that they have never told anyone. And what we do know is that that's greater for men than it is for women. But coming back to the consequences and the mechanisms seem to be around these sorts of issues and the sorts of things that David was talking about, which is the shame, the stigma, the isolation. Am I the only one for whom this has happened? And that horrible burden of responsibility. Why me? Why not my friend? Why not someone else? Why was it me who was chosen? And the powerlessness and the threats that are sometimes used and the games that are played and the manipulation of children to keep them quiet and engrossed or engaged, if disengaged mentally. And then you've got that whole issue of what were the actions of those when someone was told. One of the big issues, and I think we really need to pay more attention to this, and it will be interesting coming out of the Royal Commission, what's the impact on people of telling somebody in those circumstances? And the Royal Commission is doing research around that, which will be very valuable. What we know very clearly now is that abuse by clergy is predominantly of boys, prepubescent and young adolescent boys. 80% from the studies that we know, both Australian and US. The issue is around the dynamics for men. What is it about that being a victim, does that make you not a real man? Does it have those concerns about, does it mean I'm gay and I didn't think I was, or my family won't cope with this? And the other one that has implications for families and later relationships is that the one about, am I likely to be seen as an instigator, and does it mean that I'm going to go on to be an offender? And that one should be put to rest to a large degree. So there are a range of adverse outcomes. I think one of the main messages, though, is abuse is not destiny. That sometimes the impact comes out later, but there are also a number of people for whom there is adverse outcomes who overcome that and reclaim their lives in a way that, by taking power back around that. And there are a lot of aspects that we know around the relationship between the child and the abuser, when it happened, and so on, and very importantly, the reactions of others. The support of others, and particularly in families, non-offending parents and partners, others, and so on, is incredibly powerful in terms of getting to resolve and deal with some of those difficulties. We know what the findings are in terms of, there are some significant findings in relation to alcohol and depression and alcohol and substance abuse, and they tend to be stronger for men than women. But again, that's up for grabs in some of the literature. But the interpersonal difficulties is one of the real issues that needs to be dealt with. The one about trust and intimacy, how do you deal with that? And is it for men because they don't disclose? Do we know enough about what the impact of disclosure is? Maybe I mean, it has to be at a time that the person is ready and able to deal with that and is more confident about the reactions of those around them that allows them to go on. Just wanted to show you this one. Okay, the first one is no trauma and cannabis use. The next one is cannabis use only. The next one is trauma only. Look at the interactive effect when you put both trauma and cannabis together. It's those sort of synergistic, cumulative effects that are really damaging. And we need to know much more about trauma-informed services, and we need really good evaluations. The evidence base needs to now be swung very firmly onto what we are doing in terms of treatment and services and what sort of supports really work and matter. Who they work for, under what circumstances and at what time of people's lives. And I think I will leave it at that. Thank you.